Howdy, I'm Jammer. Alright, in a previous video I mentioned, or I covered a book by one of my all-time favorite cartoonists, Robert Crumb. Now I mentioned in that video that Robert Crumb can be, we'll just say a tad controversial. He's written several comics which have really upset a whole host of people, either because of their honesty, the depiction of women, the depiction of African Americans in the work, what have you. And as I addressed in that last video, I'm not trying to make any sort of amends or apology for Robert Crumb. That's not my place. There are some of his stories I really don't like, and I'm never going to try to defend them. There are other stories of his that I absolutely adore, and I'm going to talk about them here on the channel because, well, I like comics and I want to talk about them, and I want to talk about Robert Crumb because for whatever reason I'm high-key obsessed with the man. Now, I'm bringing him up today because the book under discussion is one that, like so many books in life, I kind of just stumbled upon. I was trying to find interviews with Crumb on YouTube, which, fun fact, it's actually kind of hard to find very many. He's not really prone to giving very many interviews, and again, because of his sort of controversial nature, there's not a lot of people who are eager to interview him these days, or not as much as they used to. Whatever the case, I found an interview with him and his wife at a book fair in Louisiana several years ago, and they were there to sort of talk about their art, their cartoons, and then also to plug this book here, drawn together, the complete works by that thing with two heads, Aline and Art Crumb. Now, Robert Crumb is the creator of several notable characters that I've addressed before. You have Fritz the Cat, you have Mr. Natural, you have Angel Food McSpade. He's also one of the original creators of Weirdo magazine, as well as Zap Comics, a comic which was extraordinarily influential for its time. Some people may, in fact, even if they've never read the original comic themselves, probably would recognize the front cover of Zap Comics #0. Linda Berry has reproduced this in some of her own books, and there are tons of people that have referenced Zap as a kind of formative influence for them as a cartoonist or as an artist. Robert Crumb really helped establish the underground comic scene. I disagree with the idea that he created it. Some people make that argument. I really think what Crumb did was really help give it a foundation from which it could then move forward. Likewise, Aline Kominsky, the wife of Robert Crumb, second wife of Robert Crumb, was also extraordinarily influential in terms of the underground comic scene. She has published several comics, including Twisted Sister, Self-Loathing Comics, the Complete Bunch Comics books, which I haven't gotten around to reading just yet, but I have every intention to. And what's important about Aline Kominsky is the fact that she was one of the first American cartoonists to really talk about herself in comics. Now, that may not seem terribly important to a contemporary viewer, but I can assure you that's really huge. The reason we have books like Fun Home by Alison Bechdel or A Child's Life by Phoebe Gloeckner is largely due to Aline Kominsky. She was extraordinarily important in terms of the comic scene because if we look at the history of comics, we have to remember that it's not a terribly long history. Now, again, in understanding comics, Scott McCloud argued that comics has existed as long as human beings have existed, and he makes a really solid argument for that. Honestly, I agree. But comics, as we understand it in the context of this video, again, juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence, has predominantly been a commercial enterprise which started in the mid-1900s, typically through newspaper. Strips like Crazy Cat were really influential, and then later strips like, again, a lot of the Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck cartoons, Conan the Barbarian, and Popeye were really important in terms of setting the creative ground for the medium of comics. But if you look at those comics, and you should because they're damn good and really important and really, really amazing. One page of Crazy Cat is just, well, crazy in terms of its composition. But most of the comics that have been produced so far have typically been produced by, again, white men. There's nothing wrong with that, it's just the nature of where we've come from at this point. What I'm trying to get at is, Aline Kominsky was really important in terms of her career because she was one of the first women cartoonists to really try to break into the field, but she also did something that Robert Crumb did in his comics, which was she brought in an element of introspection. She was one of the first women cartoonists to go, you know what, I don't think I want to tell superhero stories. I want to talk about my experiences being a Jewish woman. I want to talk about my experiences with my emotionally abusive father. I want to talk about my body insecurities. I want to talk about the fact that I sometimes suffer from IBS. These tiny details are really important because up to that point, not a lot of cartoonists had done that, let alone any women cartoonists. The experience of being a woman in America, being a Jewish woman in America, being a woman who's married to a cartoonist, being a cartoonist herself, these are aspects nobody had really seen before. And again, it set the foundation for people like Gleckner and Bechdel down the line to come in and say, you know what, I don't necessarily want to try escapism. I kind of want to just talk about my life, my moods, my opinions, my experiences, just my thoughts about life itself. And so what does all that long, lovely history have to do with Drawn Together? Well, quite a lot, because again, something happened in the mid-1980s, or excuse me, late 1980s, which was that Robert Crumb and his wife Aline Kominsky decided to move to France. They had become kind of frustrated with American society, American culture. Robert Crumb had published 2 stories in his book, or his, comic periodical, Weirdo, which were extremely problematic. The point was, they were getting really frustrated with America, and they decided to move to France. And it wasn't long into that development that something happened. The pair of them started making comics together. And that is really huge in terms of the history of comics because for the most part, there have not really been very many instances of partner-created comics. More importantly, a husband and wife comic team was extraordinarily unheard of. I think there are a few instances today, especially in terms of the webcomic scene, where that might happen, but even then, most of the work that I've encountered tends to be where one partner predominantly handles the art, and then the other partner tends to handle the marketing and the business side of it. Drawn Together is a really interesting work because it's Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky writing and drawing the comics together. It's a mutual creative enterprise. And so this is a complete work showing all of the comics they've produced to date. So moving forward, it's really important to understand that you not only have 2 of the major underground comics artists of their generation working together to make a comic book, but you also have a husband and wife making comics together, being honestly and truthfully the only real example of that in the entire history of comics to date. And if that doesn't give you reason enough to go, whoa, that sounds really interesting, hopefully now as I talk about the content of this book, you'll go, wow, this sounds really cool, I want to get this book. But I've talked enough about history, let's get into what is this book actually about. Okay. So I've covered sort of the long history of, or at least a kind of very, very quick summary of the history of underground comics and some examples of why Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky are important in terms of the field of underground comics. Their work tends to be extraordinarily introspective. They talk about their lives, their fears, their concerns, their anxieties, their physical bodies, their body anxieties, what have you. Now, Drawn Together is not a graphic novel by any means, because Aline Kominsky and Robert Crumb, to this date, really haven't done a graphic novel. Robert Crumb has done the Book of Genesis by himself, which is a massive enterprise, and I really, really want to do it for this channel. But both of them tend to be more along the lines of what I would argue maybe is sort of like short stories, in that they tend to do small independent works that tend to get published in collections rather than a single independent work. Now, this definitely plays out in terms of this book itself. For example, the first story, Let's Have a Little Talk, was a work that was originally published in something called, it's a big book, kind of clunky, Dirty Laundry Comics. The notion was created by a mutual friend of Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky's, and the idea was they started to make this comic in which Robert Crumb tended to do most of the drawing, and then, as you can observe, Aline would then draw herself. There's something very interesting visually about this that I'll talk more about when we get into the actual form of the comics. But this first story is just a small anecdote of them kind of going about their lives and then getting kidnapped by aliens, taken up to the planet, and when they return, there's a flood that destroys their home and Robert's precious record collection. But then it changes, because then the story becomes about Aline going off and having a kind of like hippie vacation at a local commune, while Robert is going out on the road with his band, the Cheap Suit Serenaders, you know, trying to play some music, trying to occasionally get laid, meeting beautiful women, and then Kominsky going off and having her own story. It's a weird, rambling tale that doesn't really have like a plot. And that's the interesting thing about a lot of the drawn together comics, and the fact that it tends to be very rambly. These stories are mostly about the pair of them just thinking about experiences that they've had, or just doing things like mowing the yard or trying to fix their refrigerator. In fact, if you take a look at one of the stories here, Aline and Bob, that thing in the back room, you have a small story which features the pair of them dealing with the birth of their daughter Sophie. It's about their new lives as parents and the stress that they have trying to raise a toddler and trying to discipline their child, and dealing with things like lack of sleep and having to constantly clean up after the baby, or the baby, you know, taking a crap in their diaper and having to clean that up. It's not a dramatic story by any real means, but it's not really trying to be. And alongside that, you also have, throughout this book, small little independent gag comics. So, for instance, there's one series of comics in the book entitled The Crumb Family, which I actually marked one of them here. It's a book, it's a short little comic that's appeared in several collections before. But you see here, Aline is introducing herself. She then introduces Robert, tells him to tell a joke. He gets panicked, and then he begs her to come back. And then she ends with, tell him one of your one-liners, which is another interesting thing. A lot of the dialogue balloons may be hard to read for some people. One, because sometimes they can be a tad messy, but then also two, Aline Kominsky is from the New York, New Jersey area, which means she kind of has a little bit of a New York accent. Oh, crud. My phone just announced that it's going into low power. My phone just announced that it's going into low power mode right as I was kind of introducing this fact. Anyway, Aline Kominsky is from the New York, New Jersey area, so she tends to talk in that kind of an accent. That comes across most definitely in these little dialogue balloons. But these comics here tend to be very similar to newspaper comics. They tend to be just Aline and Crumb having kind of like talking heads, discussing their fears, their paranoias, what have you. But then another thing that's interesting is that later in the book, it becomes sort of like a story about their day-to-day life. We see Robert Crumb going to the post office to mail some things off. We see Aline exercising, taking walks, occasionally having fantasies about all of the boyfriends that she has. Because, fun fact, Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky have had an open marriage pretty much since they met in the 1960s and 70s. So in one of my favorite panels of the book, Aline actually has a very beautiful line where Robert is getting a piggyback ride, and I'll hold it right here for a second, but she says, I'm going to search for a planet where I can have as many shoes and husbands as I want. I think it's cute. Anyway, what's important about this book is that there isn't necessarily a solid storyline. It's kind of rambling, it's very introspective, it's about their fears and anxieties, as I've said 100 times over, and then also sometimes little weird anecdotes. A story which I'm going to talk about here when I discuss the form is this book here, Our Beloved Tape Dispenser. This is a cartoon that actually appeared in the New Yorker, in which Aline notices how Robert really loved, when they were initially moving, this water tape dispenser that held all the boxes really tight. She loves it so much, she buys one for him, and in their sort of love of the machine, they track down the company that manufactures it and actually take a tour of the company to sort of observe how this company is continuing to make really old-fashioned tape dispensers. Stop for a minute and process that. If I heard that one of my favorite cartoonists did a story about tape dispensers and the company that manufactures it, my immediate impulse would be like, what happened? Boring. But oddly enough, it's charming, because one of the things that's really enjoyable, and one of the things I absolutely love about Aline Kominsky and Robert Crumb is the fact that they're honest about who they are and what they like, and there's a real conviction in these pages. The stories in this book may sound, when somebody tries to relate back to you, kind of boring or tedious. And I'm not going to lie, there are some pages where I'm like, okay, great, you've been thinking out loud for 10 pages, can we do something here? So there is times where the book does feel a little slow. But for my own part, what I find really interesting is the honesty, is the conviction, and then just the exchange between Robert and Aline. You can tell this is a couple that is still very much in love. They still love to have sex and be dirty old pervs and punks, and they love to complain about things. They are who they are. They don't try to be anything that they're not. And hopefully, and I'll kind of end here so I can move on to the form, what's really great about Drawn Together is that you have two cartoonists who have established so much over the course of their careers, kind of just sort of settling into their new identities as the old cartoonists who are still around. They're not trying to do anything new or vitally original, and yet in that way, they're still managing to do something and create something that we really haven't seen before in the medium of comics. Drawn Together is, if about anything, just the little stories that take place in a marriage between two people who are weird and eccentric and passionate and full of convictions and insecurities, and it's just a blast to watch them just react off of one another throughout the whole read. Drawn Together, in terms of the content, is a really fun book. So even if you don't read all the stories, there's sure to be something in this entire collection that is sure just to bring a smile to your face. Now, with all that done and said, let's talk about why formally Drawn Together is actually really interesting. Stay. I swear. What were we talking about? Oh, right. Comics. So, we've discussed now a little bit about why I think Drawn Together is a really interesting book in terms of the content. But, again, we're talking about Robert Crumb, arguably, in my opinion, one of the greatest cartoonists that's ever lived, especially in terms of his visual style. If you've never read a Robert Crumb book before, if I can just pull out Fritz the cat here for a second, one of the things that's really unique about his style is the fact that he manages to really do a tremendous amount with line and detail. Even when he is providing some of the most sort of cartoony aspects of his career, he still manages to pay a lot of attention to continuity of the page and the content of the panel, the details of the work. His work is very photorealistic, but with an emphasis on style itself. And perhaps another really great example is his work on this book here, Kafka, a biography of the life of Kafka. You can see his attention to the details of forms, figures, human beings, their outfits, their expressions, what have you, and even in terms of some of the more abstract expressionism angles, he has a really remarkable style. Now, what's also interesting, too, is that Aline Kominsky also has a very unique style, but it's tremendously different. Roberts tends to deal more with a kind of, quote, photorealistic aspect, whereas Aline tends to be more iconic. And iconic, as we addressed before in the Understanding Comics videos, iconic is not just sort of like iconic. It just means that it's sort of reduced down and probably some people would refer to as very cartoony. If you take a look at just one page of the comics, let me find one of the examples that I was looking for. Yes. Looking at just this panel here, you can see an idea of what we're talking about. Whereas Robert tends to come across as very detailed. We see the lines of his face in terms of his laugh lines, the structure of his nose, the details on his glasses, the rough lines on his hat. Aline Kominsky tends to present herself as very iconic. We don't see a lot of details in terms of the features of her face. We get a little bit of laugh line, but even if you just look at these two itself, the way Robert demonstrates a laugh line is far different than Aline. Likewise, the representation of the nose. While he tends to show the sort of shape of the nostrils as well as the small little blackheads and little pockmarks on his face, Aline's nose is very basic. It's also kind of hard to see because he's wearing a hat in this panel, but Aline Kominsky's representation of her hair is also really unique. Whereas Robert Crumb tends to present hairstyles very realistically speaking. Let me see if I can't. Again, if you look at this panel here, if you look at the way Robert draws his hair versus the way Aline draws her hair, Robert's detail focuses a lot on the way hair would actually sit on his head, the way individual strands will sort of come out and be rebellious, whereas Aline, her hair tends to be, at first, kind of like this general outline with a little bit of tad detail. It seems really contrasting at first. Like, one of the things that the reader has to get over first in this book is that what's taking place for the most part is not a lot of play with panel layouts and designs. It has a lot more to do with the contrast of Robert Crumb's visual style and Aline Kominsky's visual style. So if you look at this page here, we see the Crumbs outside their house, workmen are coming by, a neighbor is coming by in his little bike shorts. Again, Aline gives him a kiss because they have a pretty sexually open marriage, but just looking at the way Robert is drawing the world around him and his interactions, as opposed to Aline, who tends to take a more iconographic approach, at first it doesn't seem like this is really going to work. But it does, oddly enough, because typically the way this tended to work out was Robert would start a panel, do some dialogue balloons, Aline would then go in, write her own dialogue balloons, draw herself, and then Robert would then go in, draw himself, and then all the subsequent details around him. What's taking place here is really, in my opinion, artistically significant because for the most part, cartoonists tend to establish a style and then they work with that style. They don't really branch it off. And especially when it comes to collaborations in terms of artistic styles, I haven't really seen very many that seem like an interesting visual approaches. Most collaborations between cartoonists tend to be somebody handles the writing and somebody else tends to handle the drawing. Drawn Together is unique because it is, as far as I can tell, again, based upon my own research and experience, one of the only comics out there in which you have two cartoonists working independently and together at the same time. It's a merging of styles. And this is something that actually plays several times to the humor of this book later on. In one of their second issues of Self-Loathing Comics, which has one of the most iconic in terms of rememberable, covers in terms of their entire history together. The story is mostly them sort of about going about their lives in France, but this story is unique and interesting because you have the appearance of three separate cartoonists interacting in the story. I honestly don't remember the name of this cartoonist himself. He tends to work with a lot of old Zorro comics, and he's actually instrumental in preserving a lot of them. But halfway through the book, we suddenly encounter somebody who, well, might be a tad familiar. In case you don't recognize this, this is Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse Comics. He was actually a good friend of Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky, and so when they were working on this comic, he happened to be in France and actually contributed a single panel to the book. And even if you haven't read all of Mouse, even if you've read just a little bit of Art Spiegelman's comics, you can see the way he's actually contributing to this collection. He doesn't distract the panel, or he doesn't distract from the story, he just contributes one page of comics of himself in his style, and then we return to Aline, and then, honestly, I don't know the artist, I believe it's Dan Klaus, who participates next, but then we also see this cartoonist here who also comes in and then just as quickly disappears. And then, right back to the status quo of Robert and Aline. What's important about this book visually is the way you see the intermingling of so many different visual styles. It's also an opportunity to just sort of observe how these two have sort of developed as artists. Because especially if you look at this page here, again, for the most part, there's not a lot of play with the layout of the panels. Robert Crumb and Aline Kominsky tend to be pretty standard in that category. They set up a square, they fill it in. They set up a square, they fill it in. Most pages you're going to get 6 panels, some pages you're going to get 9. Usually doesn't differ from that. Sometimes, however, you will get some of these sort of larger opening panels, though, to set up the story. But if you note the difference between this panel here and, say, some of the early panel work, the styles have changed dramatically. What's unique about this book is because these two have been doing cartoons and comics together for so long, you're able to see their styles slowly develop over time. Robert Crumb begins to pay attention far more, if such were possible, to the details of the work. And then also some of the other interesting things is, as they tend to go along in the later comic books, they begin to introduce color into the page, which gives some interesting opportunities to observe how Robert Crumb's line work interacts with color. Through the main body of Robert Crumb's career, he's mostly stuck to black and white. He tends to settle in that category, and it works for what he's trying to create. Nevertheless, it's still rather interesting, because in the old days, panels of a city landscape would be nothing but black and white, whereas here now we get a real sense of them as a space. As I noted in the color chapter of Understanding Comics, color is important when we talk about art, because when things are black and white, it's easy for them to become iconic. When you introduce color, they assume a pressing reality upon the reader experience. And when you have basically 25 years of comics in black and white that suddenly shifts to color, it impacts you. You begin to see the tremendous shift and the tremendous change. Now, again, one of the important things about this book, formally, as I noted, is that you're working with two very stylistically important cartoonists. One of the interesting things about Robert Crumb is his visual style. There's not a lot of play going on with the layout of the panels, but what is important is the meat and content of the panels. Whereas some cartoonists would be content to just have some talking heads interacting in an abstract space, Robert Crumb pays a tremendous amount of detail to the tiny little things contained in every single panel. So for instance, if I can show you this panel here where he's sitting down reading a book, most cartoonists would probably just have a bookshelf and a chair, maybe a lamp. But if you really hone in on this panel, you can see all the individual records of his record collection, the houseplant, the drapery, the tassels on the bottom of the lamp. Crumb fans read Crumb books, and here I can admit to it wholeheartedly without any shame whatsoever. You read his books to see all the lines that he's packing into these panels. And for my own part, one of my favorite things about this book as well is Kominsky's art, because while she herself may not be as detail-oriented as Crumb himself, she still does some very interesting things with line and composition, whether it's the show of her being able to squirt water out of her, as she calls it, cooch, or even just the way she tends to just draw her body, stylistically speaking. The joy of this book is seeing the exchange and then also just observing the way they tend to express themselves. I could get into a lot more here, but honestly and truthfully, one of the key points about this book is the visual style and the way it intermingles. You read Crumb just to observe the way he portrays the human body and the way he sort of represents the forms of work in his art, and then, of course, it would not be a Crumb book without some cross-hatching. So, I don't know how much more I really want to say after that. Formally speaking, Drawn Together is interesting, not so much because of the play with panel layouts, but more because of the way you watch two styles interact and play off of each other, which may not seem terribly important, but in terms of the history of comics, it really is, because for the most part, as many cartoonists have noted, being a cartoonist tends to be a very lonely profession. You're usually alone in a room with an inkwell, just drawing over and over and over again for hours on end. With Drawn Together, you have something a little different. You have somebody reacting to another person and managing to tell a story out of it. This is, again, the only real husband and wife cartooning team that I am aware of. And so because of that, Drawn Together is a rare and unique experience to see how two seasoned professionals and two married people are able to communicate and tell interesting stories through the medium of comics. If nothing else, Drawn Together, just by its very existence, is an opportunity to observe how cartoonists can approach making comics and how ultimately those efforts can create something really unique and really interesting moving forward. And so with that, let's get down to the last hurrah, and then we'll call it a day. All right. All right. So, not much more needs to be said about Drawn Together. I've said it already and far longer than I actually originally intended to. I apologize, these videos keep getting longer. I'm going to keep shooting for half an hour. Drawn Together is a great book. It's a wonderful book, and it's dramatically different than most of the Robert Crumb books people will have encountered in the past. Whereas Zap Comics tended to be a lot of Keep on Trucking, a lot of Mr. Natural, a fair amount of Angel Food McSpade, and then whereas Weirdo tended to be a lot of strange, bizarre, and eccentric stories, Drawn Together shows a different Robert Crumb. It shows a sort of older, and some have argued complacent Robert Crumb. I disagree with that. What I see here is a kind of new energy. It's a new phase in terms of the man's career and life. And in terms of Aline Kominsky, it's an opportunity to see how she has developed as a cartoonist as well. Content-wise, the story is interesting because we get a look into the lives of a cartoonist marriage. Two cartoonists being married together is not unheard of, but still incredibly rare coincidence. And the fact that both of them have been pretty successful about it too is also a pretty impressive coincidence. When you take to the fact that they have together managed to create a story of their lives and their individual selves, this book becomes all the more important and interesting. In terms of the actual form of the book, Drawn Together is unique because, as I've addressed already, you have two cartoonists who have been producing literally all of their lives and managing somehow or another to work together to create highly independent and original cartoons and comics. This collection is really interesting. So even if you've never read a Robert Crumb or Aline Kominsky book, there's probably something in this book that you're going to enjoy. Longtime fans of Crumb may not be entirely satisfied by this book because Aline Kominsky has been called the the Yoko Ono of comics, which I'm like, fuck you guys. Aline Kominsky kicks ass, and I will stand on that hill, and I will die on that hill. This book is really great. It's a wonderful collection, and there were plenty of times where I just had to stop because I was laughing out loud, LOLing, as the teenagers are wont to say these days. But if you're a fan of Robert Crumb, if you're a fan of comics, or if you're just interested in the book itself, Drawn Together has plenty to offer you. So definitely check out this book. You're going to love it. And with that, I think I'll call it a day. Thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As always, like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're enjoying these comics. It helps me know which comics that you're enjoying and which to focus on. And then, you know, it's just nice right now in this time of plague to know that I'm making some form of human connection. So thank you tremendously for that. Drawn Together, I believe it's produced by Liverite Books, so I would definitely recommend check out your local public library for this collection. If they don't have it, they can probably get it to you through interlibrary loan. Also check out your local comic book shop. If they don't have it, I think when I went into mine, they told me it was out of print, so it may be a little difficult tracking this one down, but definitely go in there to see if they can order it, or if they've even got an old back issue of it. And even if they don't have this entire collection, they may have a couple copies of Self-Loathing Comics in their sort of bins there in the back. So check it out. It's phenomenal. I think that's it. Hopefully, I believe the next couple of issues, or the next couple of videos, we may actually get into some age-restricted comics. Oh boy, it's going to be fun. But we will save that for a later date. Thank you again for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.